Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Max Skelton, the director of the Institute of Regional and International Studies, or IRIS, which is based at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. IRIS conducts donor-funded research on the politics, development, and economy of Iraq and the Middle East. Our reports, as well as our past webinars, can be accessed via the IRIS site, in addition to the AUIS YouTube channel for the webinars. So today's topic addresses several interrelated questions. Will Iraq hold early elections? And then whenever elections happen, what form are they going to take now that a new electoral law is under consideration? So in other words, what kind of voting system, what kind of districts, what will the political consequences be? To unpack these questions, today's panelists include Dr. Hussein Hindawi, who is an advisor to the Prime Minister. He's also former chairman of the Independent Electoral Commission of Iraq, or IHEC, between 2004 and 2007. We have Ashley Whelan from the International Republican Institute. We have Vladimir Pran from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, as well as Sajjad Jihad from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Hindawi, we will start with you. Give us a sense of the government's position, not only on early elections, but also the shape and form of these elections under the new electoral law. Dr. Hindawi? Oh, you are on mute, sir. Dr. Hussein, you need to unmute yourself. Dr. Hussein, you're still muted. So on your screen, you'll see on the left, it says mute. You can just click that to be unmuted.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Is it okay now?
Yep, it's perfect.
Hello. Is it okay?
Yes, تفضل أستاذ.
Okay, shukran. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for the technical problem, but it is always the link, the internet is very weak generally in Baghdad. So thank you very much for this invitation. Can I explain a little bit about the situation now for the elections? And the ministerial program of the Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the first paragraph, the first subject was the fair and early elections. And he wants to respect this engagement. So we have to prepare everything for this, this elections. It can be in 1 year or maybe a little bit more. It depends on the preparation, the next preparation for what we can say, the fourth angle of the elections. First of all, for the electoral law, we know that is the parliament, the Iraqi parliament voted in the end of December, last December, 6 months ago, the new law, but this law is still not complete. And also it does not send to the presidency to be certified and to be published, by this way it can be effective. So this law, we think it is also did not respond for the request of the population. The population look for a very transparent and fair elections, while in the law there is a lot of problems. Sometimes they copy from the former law, they put it as it was before, while the philosophy of the law was changed. I mean, before it was the system based on the 18 constituencies, while now they request, they put 240 constituencies on the basis of the al-Qadha. Before it was on the basis of the governorate. And I know, and also with me, that is in 2005, the first elections for the National Assembly, we adopted for the one constituency, all the country was considered as one constituency. So this changement, a huge changement, in fact. But I think we are not ready for this, in fact, especially for the commission. and also for the population. Anyway, we think it is possible not only completed, the law has to be completed, but also to be amended in different subject. First of all, for the, as I said, the nature of the philosophy of the law, it has to be, in my point of view, in our point of view, we prepare a study on this. We think it is better to go for the 80 constituencies based on the women quota. By this way, we can guarantee the women quota, first of all, and also to this kind of law. It has to be cheapest, in fact, even for the cost for the state, but also for the candidate, for all the people. Secondly, we request, that is adopted the biometric system everywhere, not only in some area, because until now we can use the both system, the handheld one, but also the biometric one. We think the biometric is more perfect. It is better for us because there is always the possibility of violation when used the handheld manner. Also for different things, in fact. For the OCV also, we have different opinion on this. For the, the special vote, also for the military and for the prisoner, everything. There is sometimes small changement, but also sometimes many important changements. This is the first angle, the law. Second angle is the commission. The commission was voted or elected by the parliament 6 months ago also, but they have a lot of experiences on this. The new board of the commission are composed from judges. These people, they have no experiences on the electoral matter, so they need time. They can do it later on, but they need time for now, training and to have more experience on the subject. But it is really not possible for now, because we have, if you want to organize a fair and early elections, we have to go quickly in this matter. So also, when they changed the former board, they changed also all the staff, in fact. The experienced staff before, people were trained and stay in the commission sometimes from 2004. Or these people, the director, the sub-director, and others, they were redundant. So we need to have other people in their place, which would take time also, and training. The third angle is the relation with the United Nations, with UNAMI, but also with the International Committee generally, and also to guarantee that is the political money has not to be excessive and influence the elections, and also for the weapons. It is generally the force used sometimes in the elections, especially outside the town and the countryside. The fourth angle for us is the population, the demonstrator generally. They have to be trained to understand their role in the elections. It's not just going to the station and to vote, but they have to know to whom they have to vote. It is their choice, of course, but sometimes they are badly used. This question is abused by political forces and others. So this is generally what we think about the situation now.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. We'll definitely come back to you with follow-up questions after we've gone through the other opening remarks. I will turn to Vladimir now. Vladimir, I'm hoping, the new electoral law, which, as Dr. Hussein mentioned, is not yet ratified, and there's still a whole lot of uncertainty around the amendments as well as the annexes. But in essence, it puts in place a very different kind of electoral system in comparison to what has been in place in Iraq since 2003. Could you help us understand what that new system would be and what some of the implications of it would be?
Right. Well, thanks for that. Let me link to what Dr. Hindawi was saying, that the change in the law on IHEC and the elections law, so there were effectively two laws, was not really an electoral reform. It did not address key electoral issues in the process, like voter registration, election disputes, use of technology, or management of elections. And as Dr. Hindawi said, there is a lot in this new law, which is, as he mentioned, not a law yet, that is old text from the previous law. Even in some cases, there are incompatibilities of the text within the law with the new system. As you know, this law, this effort to reform the elections came from as one of the demands of the protesters, and I understand the frustration of protesters. I understand their demands for accountability and for better governance, and we also understand their frustration with political parties. We understand and agree that direct influence of political parties in a manner that it affects state bureaucracy and governance undermines good governance and rule of law. But maybe we should wonder what was the initial demand of the protesters, and how come these demands turned into demand for change of electoral system? Because maybe the real frustration was with muhassasa, the slicing up the pie and appointing people into governmental positions, and having direct influence of political parties on civil service, on governance, and so on, rather through the procedural process, through the parliamentary, through legislation, through parliamentary committees, and so on. Because that kind of effect of political parties on governance undermines national governance and empowers sectarian politics. So we understand that. We just think that the influence of party in hiring and appointments of civil servants on political basis is a problem, but it's a different problem than political competition and representation in the legislature. Political parties are institutionalized political organizing, and that political organizing is protected under the freedom of political organizing as one of the basic political rights, which is freedom of association. Parties are an institutionalized political competition, and undermining their role in political arena would backfire. We don't just think that they are a positive thing, they're reality. And political competition in environments where parties exist cannot avoid participation of parties. Now, how did that translate into the electoral law and electoral system? And what happened with this electoral system? The new law, as we mentioned, does not address many important issues. It addresses and implies the change of electoral system. And it implies, but not definitely, that the new system would be introduced, which is what we call single non-transferable vote, or SNTV. What does that mean? The SNTV means that the voters have one vote, that it's not transferable to other candidates, for example, in proportional representation and list systems where the vote effectively goes to the list, or in preferential systems where the candidate who didn't win the seat, his votes go to another candidate, and so on. So if that vote that went to a single individual candidate, if the candidate didn't win, that vote is lost. This system, SNTV, is a cousin, in a lack of a better term, to so-called block vote system, which was used in Levant, and it's still used in Syria. It was used in Jordan. We sometimes even call it all Jordanian system. It was used in Lebanon, and it was used in Palestine. And except Syria, they all abandoned it because how badly it reflects the will of voters. Now, let me make this more concrete so that it's not abstract. What happens under that system? I will share my screen. This, what you can see, is a block vote system. So the system that was used in Levant region. And on the right side, you can see how the votes are translated into seats. These are results from the 2006 parliamentary elections, where Hamas won 44% of the popular vote. Fatah won 41% of the popular vote. Yet when that's translated into seats because of the electoral system, Hamas won overwhelming majority, almost 70% of the seats, and did not have to form coalition to govern. Why that happened? Look at the left side. These are the results from electoral constituency of Jerusalem. And the system is very similar to the SNTV. The difference being that voters have several votes and not one vote. However, the results are showing that the party which is very disciplined and has only number of seats or less, number of candidates or less than seats available in the district, with tiny little majority of the votes, will be winning the whole district. If you look at the list of candidates, there are lots of independent candidates. These are not, in fact, independent candidates. The usual joke in Palestine was, well, we know they're independent, but are they Hamas independent or Fatah independent? In this case, they're all Fatah independent, Fatah candidates. Fatah couldn't just register them all as Fatah because there is a limit to register number of candidates as seats available. So all the other candidates ran as independent. They split the vote, and although Fatah had majority of the votes in Jerusalem, they only won 2 seats under the Christian quota. If Hamas would have ran even those 2 seats for Christian quota, they would have won even that. They would have won completely the whole district. So it's this disproportion between the votes and the seats and dissatisfaction with these results that made even Palestine to move away from this system, and they're not going to be using it in future elections. They switched to proportional system. And in fact, they are considering system that Iraq had until now, which is proportional system in provincial constituencies with open lists. What does SNTV bring? This is ballot from Afghanistan. So it's very similar to Palestinian ballot, but as we said, the voters get only 1 vote. They don't get several votes as in block vote system. What is the effect of the SNTV? The effect of the SNTV is similar to effect of block vote. It disproportionately gives huge advantage to a party that is organized and it doesn't split the vote. Let me show you how would that work for, in constituency that has 6 seats. We would say 6-member constituency. Under proportional system, the party A, which wins 51%, would get about 3 seats. The party B gets 34% and it gets 2 seats, and the party C, 15%, wins 1 seat. So the seats are approximately proportionally allocated to the parties, proportionally more or less to their power in the constituency. However, under the SNTV, the real possibility is that as candidates are running as individuals, that party will, one candidate will win votes, a lot of them, if the candidate is popular, yet the other candidates will win a very small number of votes, and they will not be getting any seats. So they will split the votes between the different candidates and lose seats in that process. You see party B, their candidates in this scenario has votes that are more evenly spread to other candidates, and that rewards them with winning the seats. And then party C, which only has 15% of popular support, but it ran only one candidate, so it didn't split the vote, still gets the seat. So in a nutshell, this is scenario that we are afraid of, where parties that ran more candidates than they have real power will be heavily splitting the vote, number one. And number two, if they have candidate which is fairly recognizable, which is individual who has lots of popular support, he might be hoarding all the votes, and the other candidates will not be getting enough to win this tiny little majority needed to get into the parliament. Now, this is a case with fairly large constituency with 6 members, but we can look at the smaller constituencies, because that's one of the ideas in this reform is, let's make constituencies smaller so that people are closer to the elected official. In smaller constituencies, situation might be even worse. For example, this is 2-member constituency where party A gets 40% of the vote, and in proportional system, under proportional allocation, they would get 1 seat. Party B gets 31% and still gets 1 seat, and party 3, which is the smallest, doesn't get a seat because there are only 2 seats available. Under the SNTV, if party A runs 2 candidates, because there are 2 seats, and splits the vote equally, they will lose and not win any seat. Party B, which has less popular support, only 30%, might get a seat, and then party C will also get a seat. Now, why am I presenting these cases? I'm presenting it and the effect of the SNTV vote, because I think we might end up in a situation where political parties will be really surprised with results, where they will be really surprised how come the popular support that they have in the field, that they know they have because they have enough supporters and members, and frankly, they saw how many votes they had in previous elections, and they see total number of votes that they're receiving in elections, yet they're failing to get seats. I think this will be very problematic for political parties to understand and to accept. Why, if they are stronger party in the constituency, they're not winning any seats? So will this system produce desired result that the protesters were demanding? One of the demands was accountability. And in my opinion, accountability of elected representatives is not developed through the electoral systems. It's a set of measures, for example, engaged electorate, transparency of political finances, requirements that representatives hold consultative meetings, and so on. So this accountability is set of measures. It's a function of these measures and not function of electoral system. Just as example, you could look at the system in United States, first past the post, that have only single member district. So voters are in really geographical proximity to a candidate. Yet the question in many times is, who are these elected officials accountable to? Are they accountable to corporations and donors and soft money that is going into their campaigns, or are they accountable to the voters? There are many elements of accountability, and electoral system is not necessarily the defining one. The second
I just
issue.
want to interject 1 sec. Just if you could close up these remarks in the next minute. I do want to come back though to this question of, okay, if not SNTV, what is the aim of the desired reform and how do we get there? So we're going to get there. So, but if you could wrap up these, then we'll come back to this issue.
Okay, so yes, I will then just mention one thing. So what is in front of us? Where are we now, and what's happening next? As Dr. Hindawi mentioned, this law is not a law yet. It hasn't been enacted or gazetted. It will be very interesting to understand who is the ultimate arbiter, which law is effective and under which law the election commission should be preparing the elections. And I guess that would be the constitutional court, and we know the issues there. So maybe in the next round, I can talk a little bit about what would be the effects, how would that respond to demands of the protesters. And we need to mention that many things are missing in the law, as Dr. Hindawi said, and there are a set of recommendations that we prepared that should be addressed in the law to get us to the point where we can effectively start discussing the electoral system and the most challenging part of it, which is distribution of constituencies and dividing provinces into constituencies, and whether that's needed at all.
Thank you, Vladimir. I think the issue of SNTV really needs to be unpacked, not only at the kind of theoretical level, but also specifically what this would mean for Iraq. So I'm hoping, actually, one of the things that Vladimir is basically saying is that parties that are more organized and can mobilize, sort of an organizational structure by which voters would, in a sense, be trained or mobilized towards proportionally splitting their votes across a set of candidates rather than overloading on one candidate or whatever, would be in a favorable position. So one question for you, Ashley, is, are there parties in the Iraqi system that you think might benefit from this system, or if not parties, factions? And the other question is, within the, just legislatively, where are we right now? This law right now is not a law. It's still, there's still, in theory, would need to go to the president and even the federal court. The COR still has amendments that needs to consider. The prime minister has his own amendments. Help us understand the kind of process, so those two aspects, if you could give us a sense, we'd really appreciative.
Sure, thanks, Mac. So I'll get to some of your specific questions, but I want to shift back towards a broader political view of some of the questions and considerations that will exist irrespective of whether Iraq holds early elections, on-time elections. These kind of apply almost no matter what. Citizen trust in the system is nearly non-existent. I mean, the protest movement itself demonstrated that through the calling for early elections, the reform of IHEC, and voters are looking for a way to stop the endemic corruption that the Muhassasa system breeds. And to Vlad's point, I think some of the demands from the protest movement were specific in nature, but actually targeting a different problem than what some of the mechanisms actually have. So, but in my view, there's two core issues that we need to examine and that Iraq must address in order to reset the course. And then there's two key questions that we really need to be asking. So the first overarching issue in terms of overall any elections at any point is the lack of quorum at the federal Supreme Court. The federal Supreme Court needs to certify the election results once they occur. And without going into extreme detail about the situation, essentially there's been one judge that has retired. And as a result of that, it's exposed kind of a core weakness in the judicial system that impacts the electoral system. And what that is the lack of an active law that governs the appointment of new justices. And while the Constitution requires such a law, it doesn't exist. There is a draft law, but it's been languishing in Parliament for many years now. There are some members of Parliament that have demonstrated a renewed interest in this issue, but the reality is it will take time to draft, discuss, finalize, approve, all of that. And particularly now, given the COVID-19 crisis, Parliament has been very infrequently meeting, especially recently, given that in recent weeks, given the concerns that there are members and parliamentary staff that actually have been infected by the virus. So this is something that will apply no matter when elections occur. But the other critical issue that I'd like to address that needs to be rectified is really the issue of citizen trust. Citizens are tired of a government that doesn't deliver on services. Many view Parliament as receiving many benefits without actually providing much in return. And while elections continue to be the key opportunity to redistribute power in Iraq as the political system evolves and matures, there are perceptions that political parties simply compete for their slice of pie, that they're looking for their allocation under Muhassasa, which has badly damaged the reputation of the democratic process. And to Vlad's earlier point, competition over policies is a good thing, but competition over patronage is the negative thing. And we should not view elections as the way to address issues of patronage or of kind of that level of corruption. There are other mechanisms. But for the purposes of this discussion, I would like to highlight that in our work, we talk a lot with citizens and with civil society organizations that they feel citizens they can't influence the system. So therefore they're disinclined to vote, which we've seen from the downturn in turnout. But what really concerns me is that with all of these changes to the political system, with the electoral system, there's going to be a lack of information, and that lack of information can badly continue to negatively affect the citizen trust. So in particular, if political parties have vastly different expectations rather than their actual results, which is rather possible given the unanticipated effects that an S&T system can bring, there's a real risk that Iraq is going to see more discontent, more accusations of electoral fraud than we even saw in 2018. And then for citizens to not understand how their vote will be counted, confusion over how the ballot will function in terms of, now there'll be a lack of party identification, compounded with the pre-existing confusion over the identifications needed. And Dr. Hindawi spoke about this with respect to the biometric card versus the electronic card. We saw these confusions in 2018, and I expect that they'll continue, in the next elections to come. But with all of these confusions, it acts as a barrier for citizens to not necessarily want to get involved in the system. However, the upside and the opportunity, the window of opportunity really is that the momentum for political change born out of the October Revolution movement presents a significant opportunity to capitalize on a renewed interest in political discussion, an interest to get engaged, to encourage greater knowledge, greater turnout. But what this requires is a real concerted, consistent effort to provide accurate, timely, and frankly, inspiring information, which is going to be a coordinated effort by civil society, by political parties, and by IHEC itself. So now I'd like to turn to two questions that we need to ask just in the framework of the webinar. The first is, if there are to be early elections, will Parliament actually resign? The reality is that Parliament itself would have to vote to dissolve. And frankly, the political incentive simply isn't there. Their members of Parliament currently are 70% first time elected. Resigning early means a loss of salaries, a loss of entitlements, and there's no guarantee that they'll win their seat back. So there's no necessarily incentive there, and nor would it be politically feasible for the Prime Minister to forcibly dissolve Parliament, though that's allowable under the Constitution with support and approval of the President. The Prime Minister has too many major issues to focus on. That's a huge amount of political capital he would have to expend, and it's highly unlikely, especially given the events of last week. That said, there are parties that are seemingly want to adhere to the Marjaiya's call for early elections. So a political settlement amongst Shia blocs could be possible, but in my opinion would be highly unlikely to get the broad support needed to actually successfully pass the dissolution vote. The second key question that I think we must ask, and this is to your premise intro, is who benefits from early elections? And what's the benefit to political parties? So as we heard from the description of SNTV, the most successful political parties under an SNTV system are likely to be those with the best organization and the best discipline, which unfortunately only describes a small minority of political parties here in Iraq. And from what we have learned just from our discussions with members and staff within Parliament, electoral district delimitation and these discussions have been delegated to the heads of political blocs. And while the allocation of power is necessarily a debate amongst political bodies, and that's logical and to be expected, the challenges in Iraq around electoral boundary delimitation itself with respect to the borders is going to be very technical, very complicated. There's conflicting information from different sources of information, and is something that really needs the support of technical expertise, Ministry of Planning, those that have the information necessary to actually help draw those lines so that it goes back to voters with a clear understanding of who are you voting for, which district are you in, Where is your polling station? Some of these key issues that really, you know, it sounds like too early to be thinking about that kind of stuff. But the reality is that voters need information, frequent, clear, and constant for this to actually work and for them to feel included in the system. I would say that for newer parties, you know, especially those that have been inspired by the October Revolution movement, a longer window gives them an opportunity to organize, to learn the system, to learn the electoral strategies needed to be successful. However, what might be gained in organization could be met with lost momentum. There is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a window of opportunity here that has been opened by the movement itself, and which the Prime Minister continues to represent as he addresses these core issues, you know, talking about elections, talking about transparency and accountability. And that window will eventually have an endpoint where people will get frustrated again, and then we go back into a negative kind of cycle. So in sum, what I would say is there are foundational political issues that need to be addressed before elections are feasible. However, the window of opportunity won't last for very long. And I think I'll stop there and we can talk more in questions.
Just one point of clarification, Ashley. So on drawing the districts, is the assumption now that those districts will not correspond with the administrative districts?
That's my understanding, but this is something that is under a lot of discussion because there are requirements and there are requirements about how many voters the districts need to represent in order to adhere to constitutional requirements and just the value of a vote in a district itself. And
Yeah.
I'm sure Vlad can comment more on some of the weight of a vote in an individual district.
Yeah, I do want to return to this issue because, you know, if you take the example of Sulaymaniyah province, you know, that has 16 administrative districts. Under the new law, they would only have 14. And so there is this, you know, sense in Sulaymaniyah province that there is a disjuncture between what they view as a district and what the new law would. And so, you know, it's certainly going to be a subject of a lot of contention. So let's.
Well, that goes back to the issue of citizen information and access to information and understanding, really.
Right, right. Well, thank you, Ashley. So Sajjad, of course, months ago, during the you know, the height of the protests, electoral reform and early elections was the most consistent request or demand of the protesters in many ways. And now here we are several months later. Would you say that that is still the case? Give us a sense of the protest movement's engagement with this issue on an ongoing basis, and then also how the political blocs continue to respond.
Thanks, Mac. Thank you to everyone for joining. We've had some excellent input already from the speakers, so I'll just look to complement some of that and to answer your questions. Elections are due in May 2022, and protests began in October 2019. The law only passed in December 2019. That means for 3 months, there was pressure from demonstrators for electoral reform before Parliament decided to do something about it. They haven't completed the law, as we've already heard. And it shows that actually parties, Parliament itself, does not really want to does not want to get engaged with the process of early elections. They want to keep it to regular elections. And electoral reform opens up, it's like a can of worms. It opens up so many questions. They wanted to avoid it as much as possible. And it was only pressure from protesters, pressure from a large number of the population throughout Iraq. It wasn't just in Baghdad. It was all over the southern part of the country. And the sentiment existed amongst youth in other parts of the country. Only because those voices were amplified and heard that suddenly parties felt a bit more accountable and they decided to engage in this reform effort. And as we've heard, it's not there yet, partly because they can't agree on a way forward. At the last elections, over 70% of MPs were new. So that means around a quarter of MPs were the ones that kept their seats. 3/4 lost their seats. And as Ashley already pointed out, that's a huge disincentive to hold elections at this moment in time, because you can't guarantee that you'll keep your seat or that parties don't become weaker. And I really am concerned about the fact that we are putting all this pressure on elections where we could have a repeat of the same thing in 2018. As Ashley mentioned, protesters want electoral reform, but they don't want early elections just for the sake of early elections. They need to be effective elections. They need to bring in new players and new faces. They need to make changes to the system. Otherwise, if we're just going to add some seats to one party and take some seats from another party and bring a couple of fresh faces, that doesn't really meet with the demands of protesters. And I think that's partially where the concern is at the moment, that we're so engaged with the actual electoral process and how it's going to work that we're forgetting actually the whole point is it's supposed to change the way politics operates. And I kept hearing the word muhasasa, and that's at the heart of the issue. And as Ashley mentioned, early elections to happen will require Parliament to dissolve itself, or essentially the Prime Minister and President to act to dissolve Parliament. And I can't see either scenario happening, to be honest with you. And that means we've got less than 2 years to regular elections. And as we've already heard from Vlad and Dr. Asir, the amount of challenges that exist technically means that realistically, we can't expect elections to happen next year anyway. So it looks like early elections at this moment in time, not going to happen. It looks like we're going to go into 2022. And the challenges, I'm not going to talk about technical because Vlad addressed them and took this in, but on the political side, I've outlined 4 kind of challenges. Number one is finishing the law. So the main text of the law was approved in Parliament, but the text of the law refers to addendums, specific addenda that go into detail about how the electoral law will act. So it mentions that an MP will be voted in, 1 MP for each 100,000 citizens, and that the constituencies will now be by districts rather than by province level. The problem is we do not have a confirmed set of administrative districts. There is disagreement, as you mentioned, in Suleimaniye, in southern Iraq. We have gerrymandering that's been going on. So we need to first identify the number of districts. Second of all, what do we do when there are districts that have less than 100,000 population? That's not enough to vote in an MP or to have an MP according to the draft of the law. So that means the district is likely to be subsumed into another district, a larger district. So those votes then get transferred to the larger district. So potentially, if I'm from a rural area, and let's say I'm an MP who has a lot of tribal connections, I'm not represented well in another constituency, but in this rural constituency, which has maybe 60,000 population or 40,000 population, I could pick up votes from my kind of tribal family. And then those votes will be moved into the other constituency where I'm not represented well. But by nature of having all these kind of votes in this smaller constituency, I will then get voted in into the larger constituency. And those questions are not yet addressed. It's not finalized yet. So we need to have the addenda signed off, which there is still disagreement of in Parliament. And then once that's done, the law gets sent to the presidency of Parliament to be approved. And then it's sent to the president to be signed in. And then it's published in the Gazette, and then it becomes law. And as you can see, just administratively moving between these steps is going to take several months. And what we have at the moment with the legislative holidays, with COVID-19 affecting the process of Parliament and so on, it's not likely we're going to see any action, probably until the end of summer. The second part, which is as important as the electoral process, is the party's law. The law that defines how parties function, operate, their membership, their financing, removing the barriers to entry for new parties as well, to allow young faces and younger people and new generation of politically active people to get involved. You need to reform the party's law. And that, that's stalled as well. We haven't had much progress on that. I don't think elections will be credible until we have the party's law published as well. So until that happens, if we just have a change to the electoral process, it is very likely the same parties will stay in power. And that's really defeats the point of what the protesters were calling for. The third bit, as Dr. Hassan mentioned and others, is IHEC. We need to complete the change in IHEC. There are judges appointed at the moment in a fashion that I see as temporary holdovers. They have no experience with elections, and you've dismissed a lot of the core staff of IHEC. So there is a gap in knowledge and capability in IHEC at the moment. You can't expect them to run elections if you don't have a competent staff there at IHEC, and I don't think that that's there yet. And we can't go back to the IHEC that we had in 2018 because of all the questions over their competence and the amount of fraud that occurred on their watch and so on. So that is equally important as well. Otherwise, fraud is very likely in the next elections. And the last issue, which actually touched upon as well, is we have the federal court that ratifies, federal Supreme Court ratifies the election results. The higher judicial council in January issued a ruling that says the decisions of the federal Supreme Court should be discounted and ignored because they do not have a full quota of their justices. And as Ashley mentioned, we already have an issue with the Supreme Court law not being published. And so we have no mechanism at this moment in time to vote in new justices for them to be approved by the higher judicial council, nor do we have the higher judicial council approving, ratifying the decisions of the federal Supreme Court. So if we had elections in 6 months' time and this issue hasn't been clarified, there is no way to ratify the results of the elections according to the way the Constitution is set up at this moment in time. So those are just some of the kind of political challenges, which you can see will take up many, many months to resolve. And I can't see very quick progress at this moment in time because of the issues Iraq is facing. Now, the big parties, they do want delays. They want to keep elections on a regular cycle. And they also prefer to use bigger districts. They prefer to use, rather than the smaller kind of constituencies, they want to group up as many votes into as larger districts as possible. It suits them. And I think certainly the KDP and PUK want to, as far as possible, keep the same system that we have at this moment or as close to it as possible. Large parts of the Fatah bloc as well, state of law, and a lot of the Sunni parties that are represented in northern and western Iraq. But elements of Fatah, for example, like AAH, believe that they could be better represented in the next elections. They could win more votes. Same for the Sadrists, Sa'arun. They believe they have a fixed constituency that will show up no matter what, and they will continue to gain seats. Nasr as well believes that they didn't do well enough in 2018, and the next elections, because they appear on a reform platform, they'll be able to pick up more votes. But I don't think there is a majority of parliament yet that supports either early elections or supports reforms that are in line with what protesters want. I think the majority of parliament and parties are still trying to delay the process. And I don't think that really helps going forward. And then the Prime Minister promised on the 7th of May in his address in Parliament when his cabinet was approved, that we would have elections in 1 year's time. That looks highly unlikely, if not impossible, at this moment in time. And so, as I say, that means the Prime Minister is not going to be able to live up to that promise. And that just keeps delaying things, which leads, in my opinion, to whenever elections happen, voter apathy. At the last elections in 2018, we had a 44.52% turnout. That means the majority of the electorate, those who could vote, chose not to vote, chose not to participate. And if there is apathy going forward into the next elections, I can't see that figure being any higher. Perhaps the figure will be even lower. And so there's going to be huge pressure on the Prime Minister, the parties, IHEC, the judicial system, to try to show that elections have actually changed in terms of process, but also the system for ensuring a fairer representation accountability has changed. If those two don't happen, then I can't see any incentive for not just protesters, but the wider population who chose not to turn up in 2018 to turn up in 2022. And as we all know, there is the issue of finance to get elections going, the issue of how do we prevent fraud even under a new system, the issue of COVID-19 and what if that persists into next year and the year after, and obviously the pressure on the Prime Minister. What if the Prime Minister loses his confidence in Parliament? What if his moves to potentially change things up or take on, as he promises to do, corruption, or if he threatens to dissolve Parliament? What happens if the parties decide then to remove confidence in the Prime Minister? That pushes the likelihood of elections happening even further. And so from the protester standpoint, at this moment in time, there is a lot of talk, but it doesn't seem to be much progress. The law was supposed to have been published in December 2019. We're now in July, and we're not much further from then. Not much progress has been made from December. And so hundreds of young people were killed, over 20,000 were injured, calling for reforms. And yet, 7 months into 2020, and we still have not made much progress. And this, as coming from a standpoint of the average person on the street, shows you that the cycle of keeping the same people in power is persistent. It's able to hold on to power. And no matter what you do in terms of protests or pressure, the system is designed to be slow and to keep the same faces in the same spot. So I don't think elections, to summarize, I don't think elections will happen next year in 2021. I think they will happen in 2022. And even then, I think they're more likely to be regular rather than early elections. And third, I'm not sure about how much change will actually happen in the electoral system. And in all cases, I still expect, at the way things stand, the larger parties to do the same as they did in 2018, to do pretty well.
One quick follow-up, Sajjad. So, in the protest movement, do you sense that the energy is still around kind of this idea of early elections or around electoral reform? So, I mean, in your conversations with protesters, is there a real sense of, okay, we want the abolition of the lists, we want smaller districts, we want constituencies to be redrawn, or is that a secondary issue to the idea of early elections?
It's a good question. When the process first started, the issue was on electoral reform. It wasn't so much on early elections. But as it became very clear that the government was struggling to deal with protests and a loss of legitimacy throughout the system, not just with the government, but through all parties represented in government and in parliament, then the protest demands started to increase, and they became, right, let's remove this current government. Let's close down parliaments. You heard calls for storming of parliament from the average protester. And then it was, let's start off with a clean slate, change the system and have early elections so we can bring new people into power. We can't expect the same crop of politicians to reform themselves. Now, at this moment, I'm conducting a survey amongst protesters, and electoral reform is still there, but early elections has fallen down a little bit. I think partly because so much time has passed since that demand was made clear last year. And as we're getting closer to regular elections, the issue of early elections is no longer as prominent. Electoral reform is still there. It's still in the minds of a lot of the protesters, but early elections has fallen down the pecking order.
Thank you, Sajjad. Just so that our participants are aware, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom that you can submit your questions, and we'll open up the floor just in a few minutes here. But before we do that, I'd like to give our panelists the opportunity to pose questions to the government representative or to each other. And I'll first turn to Sajjad if you have a question for the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists, actually. I wanted to ask Dr. Hussain, how does he see IHEC being reformed? What is going to happen? Are we going to have these same judges going into elections? Will there be a change in the leadership of IHEC? Are we going to see a new IHEC into elections, or will things remain as they are? To Vlad, I would like to say, what is the UN and other international organizations going to do to prevent the same issues of fraud that happened in 2018? Because it's very likely with the current set of politicians and parties that some elements of fraud will occur again. So what is the expectation from international bodies to support Iraq, and not just in terms of the vote counting system, but other elements to prevent fraud occurring in the next elections? And for Ashley, who do you see as, from the prominent parties, who do you see as the parties most likely to support, the highest reform to the electoral system? Of the established bodies, who is most pro-reform, and who do you think is pushing for early elections among them?
So we'll first start with Dr. Hussain on the question of the Electoral Commission.
Yes, I think, it is a problem. In fact, the commission now, it has to be reinforced. The commission was voted, the member of the board was voted by the parliament. We cannot change them, except if the parliament want to change them. So otherwise, we have to reinforce the commission, technically and politically from inside. We can reinforce the staff, we can control better the work of the board and all the commission together. Also, I think we have to change a little bit the law of the commission, amended the article number 25, which redundant all the staff before. So we can use this staff again. We can change a little bit the how to recruit them again. We can find a solution for that. And also, I think the UN has to work in different two directions. First of all, reinforce the international team, electoral team. Now it is a small team. I think it is good to have better and stronger team, and everywhere in all the department of IHEC. And secondly, to reinforce the monitoring, because until now, it was the monitoring of the election in Iraq generally was folkloric, I can say that, because even the last election, they spoke about 700 international, observers, but in fact, they were generally employees of the embassy, drivers, security people. It is ridiculous to say that they are monitoring the elections. They just came to see it and to take photo, and they left. So I think we need serious control, serious monitoring of the elections. And also we need to be, the elections has to be recognized not only technically, but politically. The international community has to recognize and to oblige the Iraqi authority and IHAC also to do good elections. By this way, they can recognize the integrity and the transparency of the elections. I think there is a different way to go ahead in that direction. I think it's possible to organize an early elections in 1 year. I remember when we came to Iraq for the first election, there were no commission at all. We both the first chair, the first computer, and we did 3 elections in about 6 months. We started in mid of July, and we organized the first elections for the National Assembly, all the 18 governorate in Iraq, and also the National Assembly, the Parliament of Kurdistan. The second, we renewed the Kurdish Parliament at that time. We worked only 6 months, but there were a strong help from the UN and also by IFIS and other organizations. So I think everything is possible. This is a political decision.
Yeah, but just one follow-up, Dr. Hussein. Do you think it is possible for all of these amendments to the law to be made and all these decisions around electoral delimitation to be processed and then to have elections on time? It would seem that in order to have them on time, you would essentially have to accept the kind of scrapping of this whole reform initiative.
So, the current law is not complete, so they have to complete it, first of all. And also, there is no an ideal law. Always the law is relatively good. And I think we can do good elections with bad law sometimes. It depends on what we want exactly. If we want to have good elections, fair elections, the law is always, when we did the elections in 2005, there were just a small order of Bremer at the time. So I think, as I said, it is a political decision if we want to do good elections.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. The questions that Sajjad, the second and third questions that he put to the panel are important, but I do want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask a question to the panel. And so if we can package those and return to them a bit later in the conversation, I think that would be preferable. So Ashley, do you have a question for Dr. Hussein or for the panel?
Sure, thank you. Dr. Hussein, I think it would be interesting to hear more about how the Prime Minister's office intends to support these kinds of changes, what kinds of changes you're looking for. We've heard recently that the Prime Minister's office has a series of changes that they'd like to see. Maybe you could describe a bit more of what those changes might be or what your perspectives are, that are up for discussion.
For the Prime Minister office, generally, we think the law is not really complete and also not very, very good law. So we do proposal, not really a request, if I can say it. The decision has to be taken by the legal committee, by the parliament, the only legislative power in Iraq. So we try to press, to encourage, and to request more changement in this regard. I'm not sure they are going to hurt us, of course, because, this is political matter after all. Each party, especially the big party, they try to work for themselves, not for the democracy, but, just for God. Anyway, we think any law has to be based on the constitution, which requests a democratic elections and fair, democratic, transparent. It's very clear in the law, in the constitution. They never spoke about muhasasa or who domain the parliament. They have to respect the constitution if they want to find a compromise with the population, with the protester.
So, and sorry, Dr. Hussein, would you mind saying what are the one or two things that are most problematic about the law, in your opinion, in the Prime Minister's opinion?
I think, first of all, as I said, regarding the constituencies, we think that what they propose in the law, they propose 240 constituencies for, I can say, for the men, and then they have to select 80 members for the parliament from each 3 constituencies, which is really difficult to organize, I think. And it is, after all, it is unjust because the number of voters will be very low to select especially the women quota. So I think we propose different system, starting based on the quota of women. I mean, we have to organize about 80 constituencies, and each one about 4 to 5, sometimes 3, depend on the governorate. And by this way, we will guarantee the women quota, but also I think the number of voters will be more and better, in fact. So this is one of the main problems. First of all, secondly, I spoke about the biometric system, and also we have to have, it is requested in our proposal to have stronger monitoring, international and national also.
Okay, so the proposals that you've issued will, at least in theory, address some of the issues around both monitoring and the constituency division.
Yeah.
So Vladimir, the floor is yours.
Floor is mine for the question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess maybe I can ask Sajid about his opinion. It seems to me that this deep political crisis in Iraq is getting just deeper and deeper with these discussions over constituencies and system of representation in electoral law. And I wonder whether you think that it would make more sense to create robust legal framework and address weaknesses in the previous electoral process, which you mentioned some of them, in the fraud that you referred, or perceived fraud and problems with the electoral voting machines and so on. Wouldn't that maybe be of more benefit to address those weaknesses? And Dr. Hindawi spoke of some of them, for example, the fact that we still have voters register, which is linked to food distribution system, rather than digging into this political issue of constituencies. And the reason why I'm asking that, because I saw similar discussion again in Palestine, where there was a push for early elections, and the focus was so much on early elections that the country didn't prepare for regular elections. And then when regular election time came, the time came and went, and Palestine never had proper elections again. So do you think that maybe there is a danger that similar thing would happen in Iraq, that we would fiddle around so much with this deep issues that would deepen political crisis, and then the time for regular election comes and election commission is not ready and the electoral legal framework is not ready?
Completely agree with you on that. I think there's a real risk of us, being deadlocked in trying to change all the aspects of the current electoral system, that we don't make enough progress for political reasons. As Dr. Hussein said, it is very possible to have early elections in, as he said, possibly 6 months, but 12 months, but it's a matter of the political will. And I think this is the question. The political will does not want you to have elections in 12 months, and it's pushing us already towards, regular elections in 2022. And my concern is exactly yours, that we get bogged down in the details of trying to change the electoral law. I don't think it's possible to go back to trying to improve the electoral system from 2018. I think we've already passed that now. We've already moved beyond that issue. to us to go back now towards trying to improve the existing law, I think will be a defeat for everybody, for protester demands, for the current parties, for reformist views. Pretty much everyone will feel defeated if we're forced to say, oh, so we have to abandon this kind of progress and go back to trying to improve the current kind of system. I just don't think that's possible anymore. It's politically too costly. In addition, I think we're also forgetting the issue of provincial elections. And they are perhaps more consequential for the average citizen in their local area. And we haven't had local elections since 2013. It's been 7 years. And at this moment in time, it's not even on the agenda. Nobody's actually talking about changes to the provincial election system, nor even a date for when provincial elections should happen. And I think provincial elections will have even more kind of complications on sub-districts and the way local governments are formed. Remember, provincial councils have been disbanded now since November 2019. So we just have governors supposed to be having oversight by parliament, but essentially governors have a free hand. And this is leading to more issues of corruption and political clashes in provinces. So my perspective would be to say to prioritize provincial elections, and if possible, ahead of national. But in either case, if we have national elections in 2022, it will be 9 years since we had provincial elections. And provincial elections have the same structural issues around fraud, representation, and so on as national elections do. So you can see the amount of capacity now needed to try to hold two elections. If you try to do it together, it's very difficult. If you try to do one, several months after the other, it leaves a lot of capacity. And so my concern is exactly yours, that I think if we try to do too much, we end up not making much progress and not being ready. But I don't think we can go back to what your question was in terms of, can we just stick to the current system and try to improve it bit by bit? I don't think so. I think we've moved beyond that.
And Vlad, I'd like to give you the chance to respond in terms of, is there a framework that you would see as, more conducive to the kinds of structural changes that the protesters are calling for? If not SNTV, what? What is IFES trying to, in a sense, put together a set of amendments or suggested electoral framework that would, in a sense, capture some of these dynamics in a better way?
Well, let me start by saying, first of all, we're focused exclusively on electoral issues. My analysis, my sense is that what protesters are asking for, the accountability of the government, the good governance and rule of law, is not an electoral issue. I think that we, or the Iraqis or political forces or protesters that are framing and demanding reforms of Iraqi governance through electoral system of representation is a wrong way. I don't think that change of system of representation will bring protesters what they want. There will be no new faces in the parliament through SNTV. If you want to see the effect of the SNTV and how much it brings individual candidates, just look at Japan. Japan governing party was dominating Japan political environment for 40 years. They moved away from SNTV because of that. So what we are doing, we are focusing on few things. We believe that the robust legal framework is really absolutely necessary for IHEC to even start designing the electoral process. Right now, Iraq does not have robust electoral legal framework. EU, IFES, UNAMI, even Iraqi IHEC and Iraqi experts all had set of recommendations in 2018 which are completely left not addressed. These are recommendations that are really strengthening the process, that are strengthening dispute resolutions when it comes to things like burning down the ballot boxes and PICOS, the counting devices and so on. There are no proper mechanisms in the law to address all these things. So all these things are missing. Going after system of representation, I think it is a huge political mistake. Torpedoing the past PR system, PR open list system, and starting from scratch, I think just deepened the political crisis, and we see that. And instead of dealing with putting mechanisms in place for the next elections, we are bickering over how the provinces will be divided into constituencies in a manner which is mathematically impossible to do. It's impossible to use districts, administrative districts, as a building blocks and respect the equality of vote and respect the constitutional requirement. So that would be my answer. I think that unfortunately there will be lots of disappointed people because the tool that we are using to address the requirements of protesters, it's not the right tool. Electoral system will not be the right tool to bring the accountability to the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have one question that basically kind of poses a hypothetical and that addresses what Vladimir is saying. So let's just say that we do away with the this whole move towards district level constituencies, and we stick with a kind of governorate level constituency. But then we do SNTV. Is it possible to have a situation where a highly well-organized, protest movement might be able to bat above their weight because they are able to mobilize their voters to proportionally distribute votes across a kind of list of candidates as opposed to one candidate, let's say? Might they be able to actually get a bigger, chunk of the pie by virtue of well-organized mobilization vis-a-vis this system? Is that even possible?
I think it's not. I think it's not. Protest movements, even if they would have popular support, protest movements are not organized political forces. I simply just don't see the way that this would translate into seats. I showed you some of the mathematics behind the SNTV. I think that the number of independents which will end up in the parliament under the SNTV will be disappointingly low. This will not be independent independents. This will be Fatah independents, Sairun independents, and so on. This will still be political parties. You cannot ignore the power of political parties. Their whole existence is political competition and political organizing. So rather than focusing on let's bring new faces and independents, because experience shows us that this doesn't happen where SNTV was implemented, let's focus on other things. Let's see how the existing electoral system of representation can be modified to achieve some of the things, and let's strengthen the process. Let's strengthen the legal framework. Let's strengthen the training and oversight of the election officials. Let's strengthen the procedures that IHEC has to put in place, which right now they can't because they don't have elections law. So I would argue and advocate for a shift in focus rather than dealing with how can we build fair constituencies.
Ashley, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So to Vlad's point that this system and this shift is going to disadvantage, it's not going to have the result that I think some of us are hoping for. But what can happen and what should happen and what needs to happen is the transformation of movements into political parties, and from political parties into organized parties that are able to actually do the outreach that you were alluding to actually build that support and have their voice heard and mobilize their own voters. But what this comes back to is something that we've alluded to throughout the webinar is we're talking about issues of accountability and the application and the enforcement of laws. So there exists a political party law. It's poorly enforced, but if it was more reasonably enforced, if it was, if some of the barriers for new political parties were reduced, then you could start to see, with enough time, is in my opinion key, you could start to see political movements shift into political parties that could then actually start to secure seats. However, you're not going to see some kind of sea change where all of a sudden there's going to be new faces everywhere. And even, technically we see new faces, as we've said. The parliament is 70% new members of parliament. Their faces are new, but their political parties are not. So what needs to shift is you need to have more openings for different political parties, not necessarily more. Iraq already has 200 plus political parties. It's not about the number, it's about the quality, and it's about whether or not those parties are representative of what citizens want to see.
And another question, which I think is related, and this is for Dr. Hussein. Dr. Hussein, given all of these problems that are being mentioned, or at least potential problems with the SNTV system, does the Prime Minister support SNTV? Is there, would the Prime Minister, in this new set of amendments, is it just dealing with sort of secondary issues, such as the delineation of constituencies, or is the Prime Minister actually hoping that we will, in a sense, go back to the old system?
I think for the Prime Minister, the priority is an early elections and fair elections. Doesn't matter the law. I mean, if there is a new law, it is okay. If not, depend of the system. Return back to the old system. It will be the decision of the Parliament.
But surely, Dr. Hussein, there must be the Prime Minister must have a position on, on the new law and whether or not the new law should come to pass as currently written. Because if there is no kind of push or guidance from the Prime Minister's office, Parliament is going to remain in this sort of stagnant state.
Yeah, as I said, we have some proposal in this regard, and we discuss with the political blocs, with the legal committee in the Parliament, but also with the President of the Republic and the others. We try to convince them to explain and to, if possible, to amend the current law. But the decision will be taken by the Parliament, as you know.
Okay. And another question for the panel is, and perhaps Sajjad could weigh in on this as well, is there are certain parts of the country in which the delimitation of districts is going to be particularly complicated, especially in the disputed territories. Give us a sense of how this might play out in areas of, let's say, northern Salahuddin or wherever it might be, Ninawa Plains, where there are disputes over the size of districts, the lines of districts, and even between different sub-regional governing entities.
So I think, number one, Parliament needs to, complete the law and make it clear exactly how elections are supposed to happen administratively.
Right.
Without that, there's no point talking about how they will happen in the disputed
Right.
territory. So we need the law completed so that we know how votes are going to occur inside those provinces. So that's the first issue. The second is, once that's agreed on, there will need to be an agreement between Baghdad and Erbil over what happens in those disputed territories. Baghdad by itself can force through a vote, but then they will face either boycotts from citizens in those areas who align themselves more with the Kurdistan region, or they will likely be able to face administrative or security issues actually trying to hold those votes. So Baghdad can't really force the vote without assistance from Erbil, and for legitimacy purposes. And then the third is they need to have citizens prepared to vote. There are still displaced people. There are still people in camps. There are still people who haven't registered where their place of origin is in terms of vote. They've moved to other parts of the country, and they're not voters in the disputed areas anymore. And so we need that process completed. Until that happens, I'm afraid that it's likely that we just kind of subsume some of these districts in the disputed area into the larger districts, just for ease of administration. So instead of saying, right, we will hold proper votes in each of these disputed areas, instead subsume them into kind of a larger sub-provincial district to try to get past this.
Well, and I think what you're saying, Sajjad, around ultimately, the law needs to be put into stone before all this can really be analyzed. There's a number of other issues, especially when it comes to women's representation and minority representation, and that's come up on several questions here from the panel. How can this, if the law goes through as it's currently constructed, is there any way in which women representation and minority representation could be, in a sense, brought into the system? Because it would seem that you would not have the ability to apportion seats to those kinds of micro constituencies. Is that accurate?
So as Vlad and Dr. Hussein, I think they've already addressed part of this, is that it's going to be very, very complicated to both guarantee a women's quota and to guarantee a fair kind of share of the vote and representation. And it puts an unnecessary burden, I think, on the capacity of IHEC to deliver elections. And that's why I think the electoral law, as Vlad says, should maybe move towards clarifying the kind of existing problems rather than trying to do too much and then finding that we don't have the capacity to do it. Certainly, representing the minorities is important. It's in the Constitution. We have to have MPs from minorities. We have to guarantee that. But we have to guarantee in a way that allows candidates to stand for the minority votes rather than parties ramming through their preferred candidate from those minorities, which is what's been happening in the past. And so not allowing representation and actual accountability from those constituencies. Instead, it's just larger parties overriding, the wishes of locals by ramming through their kind of preferred candidate. Right. And same for women candidates. There's a lot of MPs, female MPs that nobody's heard of, but they've managed to get their seats on the back of, a larger vote getter or a larger party in parliament. And I think that's really unfair as well. I think women want to be able to see female MPs that they can vote for, not because a party has brought them into power and they're totally unknowns, but because they believe they can be more accountable and they're more representative of women in general. And I don't think that's where they're yet. There's a lot more work. I think we have an MP in the session with us, and perhaps he can give us a bit more of an overview of what's actually going on in Parliament at the moment with regards to this issue as well.
Thanks, Sajjad. So we're going to move to just sort of closing statements, but to frame these closing statements, I've grouped together a number of the questions coming in, and I would say the main theme of these questions would be the protesters brought a set of demands, a set of aspirations. One was to separate, to separate the political parties, which are entrenched with all sorts of access to arms and resources, separate those political parties from the candidates, so you'd have more independent faces. Is there a sense in which there is a package of reforms that could reasonably lead to those outcomes, to where the protesters' ideas of having more faces and new faces brought to fore and reduce the kind of entrenchment of these party interests? Is there a way that set of package of reforms can be achieved reasonably and in a timely manner over the next period before elections? And I'll start for closing comments with Ashley.
Sure, thank you. So I take the question, but to me, the issue at hand is not that, we should not be using elections as the way to dilute the influence of political parties. If Iraqis are rightfully so unhappy with the way in which political parties represent them, then there are other mechanisms possible. On the election side, you should see, or you would want to see, other options for voters to give their support to, so that you do have some kind of changeover. But really what we're talking about, and what I interpret and what we've interpreted from the protest movement, is that people are looking for accountability and a change in the rule of law, frankly. And that necessitates enforcement of laws and a different approach, rather than just getting rid of members of parliament. It necessitates some of what we've seen the Prime Minister do just in recent days and weeks, taking over or enforcing the laws at border crossings to make sure that financial revenues are coming to the state rather than into the pockets of non-state actors. That's the kinds of change that I believe that the protesters are looking for, which is not necessarily something you're going to achieve through electoral means.
Thanks, Ashley. Sajjad?
So the short answer to your question, Mac, is no. I just don't think there is a package that's possible there to meet the aspirations of protesters, to address the issues that Ashley just mentioned in terms of what people want to see in terms of rule of law, the state becoming stronger, the weakening of non-state actors and so on, and also in a way that allows elections to run freely and not using elections to try to weaken parties. To combine that all into a package in a reasonable amount of time, I just don't think it's possible. I think something's got to give. Vlad has pointed to that already. I think trying to change the political system in Iraq just purely through elections isn't the way to go about it. I agree. And as Dr. Hussain has already pointed out, it's a matter of political will. You can have the best electoral system, but if there's no political will, you're going to get the worst results. And the other way around, you can have the worst kind of law and electoral system, but if you have a lot of political will, you can get a good results. At this moment in time, we seem to be lost between kind of both, and perhaps leaning more towards the lack of political will to make progress. And for protesters, for the younger generations especially, I'm really concerned about apathy, or the likelihood of protesters saying, right, we need to escalate our way of demonstrating against the current set of politicians. It's not working. We've tried peaceful protests, we've tried giving our voice and giving ideas. We've tried to focus on specific issues. We've moved away from identity politics. We've talked about exact reforms that we wanted to see, and it's not working. So, what do we do next? It's either apathy and just give up completely, or perhaps, consider other means, and some of them might not be so peaceful. And especially now we're facing, the economic crisis, the fallout of COVID and other issues. I'm really, really concerned about this. The general context is there's no trust. The citizen, the young person in Iraq has no trust in the political system or in politicians. Even if you have the best electoral system, there is no trust that these parties and government and so on will allow free and fair elections. There must be some underhand thing going on that is going to allow these people to remain in power. And so this is the overriding thing that we've lost. It's to have the trust back from the citizen. I don't think in the next 18 months we'll be able to get that back, no matter how much goodwill we have from an individual like the PM. I think further out, you need more kind of goodwill towards this issue.
Dr. Hussain?
I agree completely with Mr. Sajjad on this, and I think on the other side, I don't think in Iraq the majority of the Iraqi people, they want to protect the democratic system. They want to change the electoral law, the political generally situation, but not really changing the system. So we hope, it is not a question of the request of the protester only. I think all the population, they now frustrated from the 17 years of failed and corruption and problem without a future, without, any perspective. So I think, as I said before, it is a political decision, and the political class has to see the future. If they want to stay in the same situation, I don't think they can continue as before.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. Vladimir?
I'm an election specialist, so I'm very happy when elections get some focus. However, I think that this issue of system of representation of electoral system in Iraq is a red herring. I think that it's distraction which allows political parties and everyone to debate over things that will not substantially change the governance. But unfortunately, it sucks all the air. I think the demand of protesters and of Iraqis should be really dealt with in a framework of good governance, rule of law, fair governance, sensitive government, and government that will deliver services and so on, not electoral system. I think this change of system of representation, the change through SNTV, is a huge distraction. It deepens the political crisis. And in ideal world, I would want to see change of focus on decent electoral process that will resolve the issues that we have, that will resolve the fact that we still have only 50% of Iraqis registered with biometric data and biometric cards, that will resolve the problems that now we might have voting machines which are linked to voter authentication machines and potentially disclose the secrecy of the vote, and so on and so on. Things that have been problematic for a while in Iraqi electoral process, and that there are many experts and many recommendations that address that. Instead, we are dealing with SNTV, which effectively parties can go on and debate forever. Parliament can go on and debate forever. Rather than passing laws and changing the governance system, to improve the situation in Iraq. So it makes me a little bit, I just feel that this is a distraction which will suck all the air out of potential will for reforms. That's where I will leave it.
Well, on that very optimistic note, we will close our discussion. But thank you all for your commentary, Vladimir, Ashley, Dr. Hussein, Sajjad. Very important set of issues, and we really hope to return to this set of issues because as it gets taken up again in the COR, there will be a number of sort of conversations that need to happen around the specifics. So this was a wonderful introductory conversation, and we intend to do more. You can view this webinar as well as any other webinar through IRIS on the IRIS website, as well as the AUIS YouTube channel. And we thank you to all of our participants who joined us today. Bye now.
Thanks very much.